Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here soon. I just wanted to do a quick sound check and make sure everyone can hear me okay. Welcome, Jenny, Beth, Kathy. Hi, everyone. Rosalie. Just if you are new to using the YouTube Live, you can use the chat box, but you do have to be signed into your account. So if you can hear me and you're not able to use the chat box, it's because you're not logged into a YouTube account. So just make sure you either create an account or log in and you'll be able to interact with me on the chat. And you might notice a slight delay between you asking a question and my response. That's just so that I can stream the best quality that you can view. It shouldn't be more than a few seconds of delay. So as I'm reviewing your work, just remember that you can post your question. And for those of you who are not live critique students, but you're still joining us, we're going to do a quick Q&A at the very end. Today's session is probably going to be somewhat brief just because we're just looking at our color charts and doing the Q&A for last week's lesson. I know for a fact next week is going to be a much longer session, partly because there's a few people who couldn't submit this week due to obligations, but also because next week we dive into actual portrait painting and there will be a lot of more editing and that sort of thing. Okay, so let's see. Well, it's officially 11, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Kathy, we're going to start with you. And I know some of you had mentioned you'd sent me more than one picture because it was hard to capture the full value range of your color charts. And that's fine. The biggest thing with photographing color, part of it is the lighting you're photographing under, and I did post a video on how to try and get the best lighting possible. There's a couple of tricks you can use, but also it's very common for colors to sink in, and so I noticed that on a couple of charts, and you don't need to worry about that right now because I can tell where a color looks kind of matte or grayed out. For example, some of the colors up in here, let me grab my ink pen here. All right, so like you can tell that some of these colors here are a little bit more matte looking. And the true colors will come back when you varnish your painting. So what I would recommend is letting your color chart dry really well. Give it a week. By next week it should be fine. And then I would apply you can either use a spray-on varnish, so like any kind of spray-on varnish. You can use a Damar or a synthetic version. Or you can do a paint-on varnish, which is what I did for mine, and you will see all of those true colors come back. And I recommend doing that before you start your paintings next week, because you're going to want to be able to accurately look at some of these colors when you're referencing the photo that you're going to be painting for the portrait. And it will, especially in these dark areas, the colors tend to really sink in and kind of go matte. So you're going to see all that richness and depth come right back as soon as you varnish. Okay, so Kathy, let's go ahead and talk about your color chart. Overall, everything looks really good. I know some of you had a few questions about the different types of alizarin that you can use. And then I know some of you did an extra row where you did the alizarin and ochre. I believe that's what this is. And then you did, this one's the cad. So let me just write some notes real quick so we can all kind of keep track. So tell me if I'm wrong, Kathy, but I think this is cad red and yellow ochre, and this is alizarin and yellow ochre. So that was an option. I didn't do it in mine because the video was already getting quite long, but it is helpful to have these because you can see a slight distinction between what cadmium red does and alizarin or an alizarin substitute. You will get these cooler pinky flesh tones that are slightly warmer than what you have here. And then up here, and it depends on the ratios that you mix too, but up here we have a red-orange, which is the cad red, mixed in, and it gives you a much more yellow, kind of peachy flesh tone. And often you'll find that a lot of the mixtures that I'm doing are based on those three colors as well. One thing that I would say looks a little similar is maybe these two. And it's you don't really have to go through and correct your color chart. That's totally optional. But just to keep in mind that, you know, we're just mixing like an average between, sorry, wrong spot. So here's your straight cad red. So we're kind of mixing an average between the alizarin and the cad red. But remember, there's a whole variety of scale that you could mix between these two. So you could have some that are much closer to the alizarin, and it's going to give you a different feeling for these pinks than if it's cadmium red dominant. And if you ever wanted to experiment with that, you can make another color chart where you're doing kind of like a gradient the way we did it this way, but you're doing a more subtle gradient between two colors like yellow ochre and, you know, cad red, or yellow ochre and burnt sienna, where you're just gradually, you know, creating steps, maybe like 3 or 4 steps between those colors. And the shifts are subtle, but it does help us to understand how each pigment behaves. And this is a relatively limited palette. When we're talking in terms of oil painting, a lot of artists have 12 colors on their palette, but really with flesh tones, I don't find myself venturing outside of this palette too much further. I will occasionally add an additional blue, like a turquoise. I think I had that on the supply list as an optional color. And occasionally I'll pull out another earth red, like English red, which actually looks a lot like this when it's straight out of the tube. When you just tint it straight out of the tube with white, it kind of looks like this. And you know, occasionally I'll pull that out, but oftentimes I know I can just mix these colors. So this guide is really going to help as we move forward and we're studying all the different flesh tones of each of our models. And you will find when we talk a little bit about color more in depth, I know these greens feel really out of place. You know, this is just yellow ochre and blue plus yellow ochre and white. But we will start to talk about in the lectures that you guys are receiving today, the color zones of the face. And so we're going to talk about where you're going to have these kind of dominant colors and where you're going to have these. Okay, so if you wanted to make a correction, Kathy, you could maybe take this one in the middle, because you can kind of see that the cadmium red and this middle mixture, they look very similar. You can maybe push it a little bit more towards the alizarin, just so you get a little more distinction between these three. And I realize they're already kind of similar because they're both in the red family, but it might give you a little more variety to that. And I know some of you had questions about, you know, what type of alizarin to use. And I'm using an alizarin, what's called alizarin crimson permanent, which is actually a anthraquinone red pigment. So sometimes different companies will call it a different name, but if you look on the pigment code, which is on the very back, it'll say like PR 101 or PR 107. That's going to tell you the actual pigment. And in the forum today, I will post a link. It's a really great website. It's a kind of buy like a cad red hue that's not a true cadmium red, and it's going to mix differently. So just keep that in mind. If your color chart is not matching exactly to what mine is, it could be a brand difference. It could be that your alizarin is not or it is a true alizarin, or it's alizarin substitute. The main idea though here is that we have a very orange red and then we have a very blue red. And that's going to, you'll see how that comes in handy as we paint our model this week. She's very fair and she has very cool skin tones. So you'll see that we're going to be focusing a lot in this range. Kathy, do you have any questions? Your value steps look really good. So I realized that like our pure colors, which sit here in this row, they have different values. So it's not going to be like a perfect gradation between each row this way, just because of that natural value of each color as it comes out of the tube. But that's okay. The idea here is that we just see a nice range. All right, well, this looks great. If you want, you can varnish this once it's dry, and you can always label it if it helps you to remember what those mixtures are. You might find that's helpful when we dive into the new lesson this week. All right, really nice work. And if you think of any questions, just pop in and write them in the comments there. All right, Angela. You're welcome, Kathy. Yeah, this week, like I said, it's not going to be as intensive, but next week, you guys might want to grab a cup of coffee for our lesson because we're going to be covering a lot in our critiques next week. So this week, we're just kind of focusing on the color. But if you guys have questions, not just about the color chart, but also about any of the color theory concepts in the lecture, please keep those in mind, and we'll do a quick Q&A at the end of this, and you guys can ask your questions with regards to that. Okay, so Angela, this looks really nice. I think your values look pretty solid. I think you were the one that had a question about how everything looks kind of matte. Just don't worry about that. All these colors will come back true as soon as you varnish it. So just let it kind of dry up a little bit. Mainly what's going to take a while to dry are these whites, especially if you use titanium white. Now, when I do my demonstration for the portrait, I don't use titanium white. I use a lead white. And so the colors will have a slight transparency to them compared to the titanium. But I find that titanium just mixes much quicker, doesn't use as much white when you're doing a color chart. So that's why we're switching between the two. And if you guys want to stay with titanium white for your studies, that's perfectly fine. Just use what's comfortable for you. I like the lead white because it just has a tendency to leave a lot of saturation in the flesh tones because it doesn't tint as strong as the titanium. And also titanium white is a cooler white, so it has a tendency to really cool off your highlight colors, whereas a lead white is a little bit more of a yellow white, and it will kind of maintain some of that warm glow that you often see in old master paintings. So that's one of the reasons I use it as well. But that's entirely optional. Yeah, I think your value steps look pretty good. I think I see a good step between these, and you can really see that how cool this alizarin feels. So I think you have a good step there. Here, I think they just feel a little bit similar, especially between the Cad Red and this one, only because it looks like you applied your paint kind of thin. So whenever you're doing a color chart, it does help to apply the paint. You don't need to have it really impasto, but it does help to have it slightly thicker, because when we thin out paint, it has a tendency to behave slightly different, especially when you're working with transparent colors. So just keep that in mind. You might want to hit maybe some of these that feel a little bit thinly applied if it seems to be altering the color, especially because we have this gray background, so it's going to start to show through a little bit in some areas if you're kind of scumbling or applying your paint really thin. So just keep that in mind. Other than that, your colors look really good. So I think, let me just take a quick look through here. So here's your straight burnt sienna, straight ochre, and Cad Red and alizarin. Yeah, I think your values look pretty good. So I think the guide will be sufficient for for working with your flesh tones. I would recommend, though, that you varnish it before you start mixing or using it to reference for doing your portrait this week. And if you have any follow-up questions, Angela, just let me know. All right, Colin, are you here, Colin? Now, just for those of you who are brand new to the critiques, sometimes because of time zones differences, some people can't attend live, and that's okay. So if something comes up and you can't watch this live, I will be posting a link after every session in the community forum where you can watch it after the fact. It takes about an hour for YouTube to process the video recording and put it up. So it might take a little bit, but I will post a link. And so you guys can always come back and revisit this, or you can watch it at a later time if you can't make it live. So I just wanted to put that out there for those of you who are new to this. Okay, so Colin, I don't know if you're here, but this looks really good. I think I like that you use tape, so this is a great option for everyone to use tape for your labels if you don't want to write directly on the canvas. It does help you when kind of getting your bearings on your color chart when you're starting to mix your flesh tones for the portrait paintings and the portrait studies that we're doing. You might be like finding this color, you're like, I see that color, but I don't remember what that mixture is. You know, so you can just look here, it's burnt sienna, cad red, plus white. So that can be really, really helpful. Yeah, this looks great. I can see you did the 2 extra rows, which is really, really helpful. And that's always an option for those of you who didn't do it. If you want to, you might find it helpful. You can see the colors are very similar, but it really depends. And occasionally I'll mix all 3 together. I'll have cad red, I'll find it needs a little cadmium red, a little bit of alizarin, and yellow ochre. It just kind of depends on, you know, what I'm trying to match. But overall, you know, this gives you a huge variety of colors to work with for skin tones. And you can already kind of inherently see someone who might be a darker flesh tone is going to fall more in this range. Someone who's really, really fair might fall into this range. And even within fair skin tones, as we'll talk about, you have people who have a warmer tone or a cooler tone even within that fair range. So there's a lot of variety, but this guide is really going to help with that. And then you included a picture of your brands. So this is just, I included this for everyone to see because, you know, I don't use the same brand across different colors. You don't have to. It can be helpful, but the main thing is that you are somewhat consistent with the brands you start to work with kind of moving forward. Because you will notice a distinct difference between colors in different brands. And I just recommend experimenting, trying a couple of different brands and see what you like, and then kind of sticking with that color. So for example, my cadmium red light that I always buy is from RGH. They have a very highly pigmented cadmium red light. It has just the right amount of that kind of orange quality that I want that's similar to a vermilion without the price tag. True vermilion is very expensive. And it's very high quality. It doesn't mean I don't occasionally use another cad red, but if I switch to a different cadmium red, it might be a more blue cadmium red. Like there's some brands that are a little bit cooler. You can even see here, this one is slightly cooler of a cadmium red than the one I'm using, which is more of a cad red light, which tends to be a little more on the yellow side. And I do that so that it has more of a distinction from my alizarin or my cool red. Essentially what I'm doing in my palette is I have a warm red and a cool red, and then I have like an earth kind of neutral, and then we have of course our yellow, and occasionally I have another yellow on my palette like a lead tin yellow or a Naples yellow, and so you kind of have a cooler yellow, which would be the ochre, and then you'd have a warmer yellow, which is, you know, like your lead tin yellow or Naples. And that just gives you a few more options as you're, you know, determining your model's flesh tone. Are they warm? Are they cool? And then that's going to kind of influence where you're choosing your colors. And even in the blues, blue overall is a cool color, but you have warm and cool blues as well. Blues that are more towards, you know, like red, which is like a ultramarine, and blues that are more towards like a green. like a phthalo. I don't use phthalo in skin tones because it's too powerful. I use a like a turquoise phthalo, but I hardly use it in the actual flesh tones. Jenny, to answer your question really quick, yes. So your question was, I have a vermilion red and also a lead tin yellow. Is it worth doing this value chart with those two? I think it would be helpful to just do some experimenting. So I did have those on the supply list as optional colors. I don't think I had the vermilion, but I had the lead tin yellow and the turquoise. And it's because I might end up pulling those out as I'm working if I'm finding that this color range is not quite getting me what I need. So it would be helpful maybe for you to do you can compare the vermilion to your cadmium. That might be useful. And also the lead tin yellow, how that mixes with like one of the reds. You can pick like now lead tin yellow tends to be a very weak pigment. It's not really, really strong. So if you add any cadmium to it, it's going to be overpowered really, really easily by that cad red. So it might help you just to do a few squares. You don't even have to do a whole value scale, but just to get a feel for how the pigment behaves, when mixed with other colors. And it'll give you a kind of a sense of your options out there when you're assessing your colors for your model. Okay, so Colin, your color chart looks really good. It's a little sunk in here, so like I said for everyone else, just go through and apply a varnish. Since you have your tape here, you might just take a brush-on varnish like Gamvar or something similar and just brush over the square. That's what I did on mine. I just took a small sponge brush and just applied it to my colors themselves instead of the gray area. And it brings back all those true colors. Oh, you're welcome, Jenny. Yeah. And yes, you can kind of explore that turquoise as well in the same way. You can mix it with well, the turquoise, we used blue kind of to make our shades, but turquoise, you could mix it into, if you mix turquoise in with alizarin, you're going to end up with kind of a violet that's a little bit, and if you mix them in equal parts, you're probably going to get something very, almost like a rich black. So it does help to kind of experiment. In general, I recommend people who are kind of new to flesh tones and color mixing in this kind of intensity to keep their palette somewhat limited, because the more options you throw on there, the more overwhelmed you're going to get with your choices. So, it's good to introduce some and experiment, but maybe for the first painting, leave those two out and see how comfortable you are using this color chart. Okay, so yeah, I think this looks great. I see a nice distinction. I think the color, your cad red, let me see if I can, I'm thinking this is your straight cadmium red, but it looks like it has a little white in it. I can't tell because it could just be sunk in, but I think your cadmium red is a very cool one, this Michael Harding cad red, and it looks like it's just straight cadmium red, which does tend to have more of a blue cast to it. So it's going to look a little more similar to your alizarin. So just keep that in mind. If you wanted to push your range in colors a little bit further apart between those two reds, you could try using a cad red light. Even Michael Harding, this brand here, would probably have a cad red light. And like I said, I only do that because it's more of a red-orange and it gives me more of a distinct difference between the alizarin and the cadmium. Other than that, everything looks fantastic. So if you have any follow-up questions, Colin, just post in the forum or send me an email. All right, so Beth, it is your turn. And I think you said you had sent me more than one image. So I'm going to pull up this one here real quick. Because I realize that it is kind of hard when you have this extreme of a value range. Cameras really don't like it. It can be you either lose your darks or you lose your lights, and that's always a challenge with photographing paintings too, high contrast paintings. So I'm just looking at your lights here because this is the slightly darker one. I can still see your color distinctions in here though. This looks great. I can still see this kind of burgundy, but it's different from this one here. So that looks excellent. Let's see. It looks like your CAD red to alizarin shift is really good. I can see 3 distinct values there, and especially when we get down into here. And you know, it's funny because this color right here, I refer to it a lot. This mixture, it looks very similar to the one I often end up using in like the cheeks or the lips for a lot of different flesh tones, because it's kind of, it fits a lot of different people. Sometimes in the darker range, but oftentimes you'll find yourself mixing these two together to get those colors. It's a really nice kind of middle ground. It's slightly warm, slightly cool, so it works for a lot of different situations. Let's see, your other value scale. I'd say that, so here's your straight ochre. I would say you could go a little darker with these. I can't tell if it's just that they're sunk in. So if they, let me pull up the other picture. Yeah, they look a little light. So you might go through if you want to see a little bit more range in the ochre to blue range. Like right in here. So here we have our straight ochre. And it could be that your ochre is a really light ochre. Did you mix any white into this ochre here? This square here? No? Okay, it could be that your brand of ochre is just really pale. And there is a yellow ochre pale, I believe, out there. But some brands are just, with ochre, it's an earth pigment, so there's often a huge distinction between brands. Sometimes you'll grab one, I think there's one from, maybe it's Old Holland, or it is so dark and like kind of dirty looking. And then, okay, it's a little darker in life than the photo. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So so long as your value range here feels like you can see all the way into like a really, really dark green, kind of the way these feel, then you're fine. I just want you to be able to see some of those colors as we move into the flesh tones for the model. So your ochre is gambling. Yeah, okay, so maybe it's probably just the photograph kind of capturing that. Let me pull up the other one here. Yeah. So like I said, some ochres behave slightly different too. I actually like the Gamblin ochre. It's a nice vibrant ochre, and I find that it doesn't kind of make dull flesh tones. I have bought other ochres, like I said, and they almost looked more like this. They were kind of a little more dingy feeling, and they don't give you these nice vibrant colors when mixed with like CAD red. So that's something to keep in mind just for everyone, that your brand can make a difference. Overall, this looks excellent though. Do you have any questions? So this is the delay I was talking about for those of you who are new to this. There's a slight delay between. All right, perfect. All right, Beth, good job. Yeah, it is fun. It's a little tedious. For those who've done a ton of color charts before, you're like, oh, great, another color chart. But I tried to keep this one kind of limited, so we're not sitting there mixing, for 3 or 4 days of color charts. But if you guys want to explore that more, like I said, you can add in some colors to the color chart, or you can make more steps between 2 different colors. And that's a great way to kind of get a feel for how different ratios impact how a color feels. Also, the way I've structured this color chart is, I'm going to use yours real quick, Beth, is that we kind of have our shadows, our shadow mixtures kind of somewhere in this range. And you'll notice that none of our shadow mixtures have any white in them. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but in the class. But that's one of the kind of key principles, is that we have this kind of dividing line somewhere around here where we have our light masses and our shadow masses kind of naturally built. So whenever I talk about mixing shadow colors, that's actually a common question I get, is how do you make a shadow color that's, you know, nice and rich? Oftentimes you're just mixing a yellow with a red and a blue. Sometimes you don't need the red and yellow together if you're using something like a burnt sienna, which already is kind of like an earthy red. Okay, so Jenny, it is your turn, and yeah, this looks really nice. It looks like you also did that extra step down here and at the top here. So was the one down here yellow ochre and alizarin? And the top one was cad red and yellow ochre? I just want to make sure I'm not mixing them up, because they actually look quite similar, and that could be that the two colors are yellow ochre dominant. Okay, so all right, so what I would suggest, just because this looks so similar to the top one, is maybe make the bottom one a little bit more alizarin dominant, if you want to go through and correct it. I think it would give you a little bit more of a sense of how these mixtures differ. And you and I had spoke about how the different alizarins, like your alizarin is actually quite hot. And we had talked about using maybe a different one, like an anthraquinone red or a quinacridone rose or something like that, that has a little bit more of a blue cast to it. So if you wanted to, you could kind of keep this and add an additional row below if you have space. And you could do kind of keep this one the way it is, just for your own reference, and then do one with the cooler red and just make a note for yourself. Like you can use the anthraquinone rose or red that's a little bit more blue cast, mix it with a little ochre, and do the same kind of scale from light to dark. And it'll give you a sense of how the alizarin and that other anthraquinone behave slightly differently. If anyone saw our post in our conversation in the forum, the alizarin crimson that I was using is Winsor Newton Alizarin Crimson Permanent. Alizarin crimson, the original pigment, is actually a fugitive color. Fugitive just means it's going to fade with time. It's not very light fast, and so I don't recommend using an original alizarin crimson pigment. I recommend using one that either says it's permanent, or a color that substitutes alizarin crimson is anthraquinone red. I believe it's pigment code PR177. I posted it in the forum, so take a look for that conversation between Jenny and I, and you guys can see my recommendation. So if you're, and it also when compared to an original alizarin crimson, you can tell that the anthraquinone has a little bit more of a bluish cast, but that works for us because it pushes it again away from that cad red and gives us a little more range to work with. Rosalie, your question, have I done this chart using a green rather than the ultramarine blue? You could use something like a Viridian. That actually works well for flesh tones, but I find that a lot of greens tend to maybe overpower some of the mixtures. It depends on the green, like if you're using like a phthalo green, it just kind of depends on, but I find that because we have ochre and blue, we can make our own greens. So like, let's say you did want to make a color darker with the blue, but you wanted to introduce a little green into it, you could just throw in a little ochre or even a more transparent yellow. like a Indian yellow or something like that. This is kind of loosely based around a primary palette, just to keep things simple. But like I said, you could use, oh, okay, you're thinking about complementary colors. Well, the more complementary color you add into, like when you're creating a shade, a dark, if you add a complementary color into it, like a green, it's going to kind of neutralize as it gets darker. And with flesh tones, oftentimes we want to maintain some of that intensity and chroma, that richness to the color as it gets darker. There are exceptions to that. If you have a warm light situation and the model has cooler flesh tones, then you could expand and try using a Viridian green or something to neutralize that. But yeah, that's a great question, and I know a lot of artists who do use a green. I just never find it necessary for me. I never put a green. I guess the closest to a green would be that turquoise, phthalo turquoise that I like, and that's really only a color I added to my palette in the last year or so, and I really like it. But I don't find myself using it too often in flesh tones, with the exception of a few areas. Like maybe occasionally I'll put it with a little bit of white to get a cooler highlight than what I can get with ultramarine blue, for example. Okay, so yeah, this looks great, Jenny. Do you have any questions? Oh, you said yours was Michael Harding. I just saw your comment there. Yeah, there could be some difference even between brands too. And if you look on the back of your tube, it will say what the pigment code is. And like I said, I'll bring that up onto the forum today. I'll find that website. That it's a really great website I go to. They just list pigment codes, and it talks about light fastness and a couple of other things, but you can actually search a code or even search a color and see if the tube that you bought isn't actually like that genuine pigment, or if they're just calling it Cad Red, or they're just calling it alizarin, but they're actually using, you know, something that's not a genuine alizarin crimson. All right, well, I think everyone did a fantastic job. We're going to probably wrap things up here soon. Like I said, today's going to be quite short, but let's go ahead and do a quick Q&A. I think, Jenny, your question was, what pigment should it be again? I think it's PR177, but that's just off the top of my head. I think I put it in my reply to you in the community forum. That should be the one that's anthraquinone red. So, and it's one of the best, I think, substitutes for alizarin crimson. But I've also used quinacridone red, which is slightly different, and that depends on the brand. Mgram, which is a really nice brand, they call theirs an actual anthraquinone red, and it's a really beautiful color, and I use that one quite often as well. I just ran out of it, so I might end up switching over to that, but it's the same pigment code as the Winsor Newton alizarin crimson permanent that I was using for this color chart. So when I swap those out, it shouldn't be too big of an issue. And that's just part of, you know, learning to paint, is sticking to kind of a somewhat familiar palette, and also getting a good feel and kind of developing an intuitive understanding of how your pigments behave. So if you're always coming to your palette and you're using different colors every time, you're not going to develop that familiarity with how your pigments behave. And I always suggest for beginners to start off with a very limited palette and then slowly introduce additional colors. And because you have to first kind of force yourself to learn to work within those limitations, and also it forces you to mix the colors you need instead of just grabbing one that's out of a tube that looks close to what you need. It's just a great way to develop your understanding and your eye for color. So let me catch up on your questions. Okay, so which yellow ochre? Let me see your yellow ochre here. Which brand are you using for your yellow ochre, Jenny? So it looks like this is your yellow ochre. It looks a little bit on the darker side. I believe the yellow ochre I'm using is the Gamblin. I'd have to look at my video, but I'm pretty sure it's the Gamblin. But I've also been using RGH yellow ochre, and it's a true yellow ochre. It's very, very good quality too. So if you can get access to RGH artist oil paints, so if you type that into something like Google, you should be able to find him. Very affordable, and his yellow ochre is really beautifully balanced. And I have a huge tub of it, so I think that's what I've been using. But Gamblin also has a good one. Oh, okay, yeah. So that could be why your ochre is kind of a little bit on the darker side. I think it's okay, but if you want to, maybe switch over to a better quality brand. I don't actually use Winsor and Newton very often anymore because I find that some of their colors, it's not my favorite. I tend to stick with something like Gamblin, M. Graham. I use Natural Pigments. I use RGH. I'm kind of all over the board. But there's certain colors I found in one brand, and others are just tubes I've had for ages, and I just haven't run out of the color yet. But that I'll switch to a different color maybe down the line. Yeah, RGH actually, he's very affordable too because you're buying directly from the manufacturer. So same thing with Natural Pigments. So I definitely recommend checking him out. His cadmium red, you might go into an art store and buy like a Winsor Newton cad red for 40 30 40 dollars US dollars, and then you go to RGH and you're definitely going to get a better deal. You're going to get more volume for the price. All right, does anyone else have any questions? So this is kind of an open Q&A session. This can be any questions you have about color theory in general, or the color theory video, or what's coming up in the next week. I just want to make sure I have a chance to answer anyone's question. And this includes those of you who are not part of the live critique group, but you are attending to watch. So feel free to text in the chat box any questions that you have. And just as a reminder to everyone who's attending, you can also post your questions in the community forum. And I check that every day. I get a notification every time someone posts in there, so I try to respond as soon as I can and answer your questions and give you references. So if you guys come up with a question after this, or you're struggling with this week's lesson, because it's a pretty intense one, then of course post in the forum and I will try and get back to you. Usually I'm pretty good about getting back within a few hours because I check my email quite often. But yeah, this week we have, I think there's about 5 videos. There's a lot. It's a pretty intensive week because we're jumping into painting fair flush tones. And there's kind of a step for, preparing your panel. And I think, Jenny, you were the one who had asked, should you tone all of your panels that way? It's optional. So what I did was I showed in the first week a pre-toned panel where I drew on top of the dried tone. So if you do tone it, you want to let it dry for a day or two. And then you can do your drawing on top. Another option is to do your drawing first and then seal the drawing and then tone after. And I show that next week, just as an alternative for those who are like, oh, maybe I forgot to tone my canvas in time, and didn't give it a chance to dry. And then you can actually do your drawing first and then seal the drawing using a light drawing fixative. And I do mention the pros and cons of doing that in the following lesson. But just to give everyone kind of an idea of different options. But generally speaking, yeah, you could tone all 3 now if you wanted to, and just let them dry out over the next few weeks, and then you're all set to go. Alrighty, well, it doesn't look like anyone has any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you everyone for attending, and if you do come up with a question later, just go ahead and post it in the forum and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I hope you guys enjoy the new lessons. It's a lot of video to watch. I kind of broke down the main demo into shorter sections, so you can kind of watch one part of it and then take a break, because I realize it can be tedious to sit there and watch. I also wanted to point out, though, that in the video player on the website, so the streaming video player for the course lessons, there is, if you press the little cog button that looks like the settings, you can actually watch in like at a slightly faster speed. Of course, I'm going to be talking at a faster speed if you watch it that way, but just I wanted to let everyone know that is an option, because it does go on for about 3 hours. I think the demo is about 3 hours. Plus, that's just the portrait painting demo. That's not including the color mixing and the drawing and the preparation. All right, guys, so thank you again, and I'll see you guys next week. If you have questions about homework, just email me or post in the forum. All right, have a good one, guys. You're very, very welcome. I'll see you guys next week.